For 11 consecutive years, every 14th of March, the richest woman in the entire Pacific Northwest aerospace industry drove alone to Evergreen Rest Cemetery, carrying a single stem of white orchid. But this year, when she arrived, someone was already there before her. A man was kneeling in the wet grass, and beside him, a small boy was folding something out of pale gray paper, pressing his thumb into the crease 3 times before he ever looked up. That single motion, the exact way his thumb pressed down 3 times, was about to unravel everything Catherine Ashworth believed she had buried along with her daughter.
Hearing up to here. Stop for 1 second. Try to guess who that boy could possibly be to her.
Type your guess in the comments right now, before you hear the answer, because I promise you will not see this coming. And if you have not followed this channel yet, please tap follow before we continue, because what happens in the next few minutes is far stranger than anything I have told you so far. Catherine Ashworth did not start life anywhere near private jets or boardrooms. She grew up in a narrow rented house outside Tacoma, Washington, the daughter of a woman who cleaned office buildings at night, and a father who repaired small engines in a garage that never quite made enough money to keep the lights on through winter. As a girl, Catherine used to sit on an overturned bucket in that garage and watch her father take apart lawnmower engines piece by piece, laying every bolt out on a clean rag in the exact order he would need them again. She once asked him why he was so careful about the order. He told her that most people think engines fail because a part breaks. In reality, he said, they usually fail because somebody put them back together in the wrong sequence. Catherine never forgot that sentence. It became the quiet rule she built an empire on decades later. At 22 years old, with a business degree paid for entirely through night classes and 2 exhausting years of waitressing, Catherine used almost every dollar she had saved to buy a failing surplus warehouse full of retired aircraft parts nobody wanted. Where other people saw scrap, she saw sequence. She saw an industry that constantly needed dependable, honestly priced components, and nobody willing to slow down enough to sort them correctly. Within 7 years, that single warehouse had grown into Ashworth Aerospace and Flight Systems, a company supplying precision components, maintenance contracts, and eventually entire aircraft assemblies to regional airlines and private operators across 3 states. By the time she turned 40, Catherine sat at the head of a board table in downtown Seattle, in a glass tower overlooking Puget Sound, running a company worth more than most people could imagine in a lifetime. But unlike the cold, distant version of a self-made tycoon the world likes to imagine, Catherine was, for many years, a deeply present mother. She used to kneel on the driveway holding the back of a bicycle seat, running alongside her daughter Elena, until the girl finally found her balance and pedaled the length of the whole cul-de-sac without looking back, laughing so hard she nearly fell twice. She used to leave board meetings early every single Thursday to pick up her son Julian from soccer practice, sitting in the parking lot with the engine running just so he would never once have to wait alone in the cold. Every August, the whole family flew out to a small cabin on Whidbey Island, and for 1 full week, Catherine refused to answer a single work call, choosing instead to sit on the dock with her children, teaching them how to skip stones across the flat gray water. Catherine's tragedy, if it can be called one single thing, was never that she was an absent mother. It was that she never learned how to release her children once they had grown large enough to carry their own weight. She loved by designing the future for them, and she genuinely believed, with her whole heart, that she knew the shape their lives were supposed to take. Elena Ashworth, her eldest child, died at 31 years old. She was a brilliant, quietly stubborn aerospace engineer who had spent nearly a decade being groomed to eventually take the chief engineering seat at her mother's company, and possibly the entire company itself one day. But the conflict between mother and daughter was never built on resentment or neglect. It was the collision of 2 people who loved each other completely and still could not agree on what a meaningful life was supposed to look like. Catherine wanted Elena in the executive wing, signing off on new aircraft designs that would carry the Ashworth name into the next 50 years. Elena wanted to take the very engineering skills her mother had helped fund her education for and pour them into something smaller, something the balance sheets would never fully capture. She wanted to build a non-profit flight training program for teenagers in the Rainier Valley neighborhood of Seattle, kids who had never once had the chance to sit in a cockpit or even imagine that the sky was something that belonged to them too. Catherine believed her daughter was wasting extraordinary talent on something with no scale, no lasting structure, nothing that would outlive a single grant cycle. Elena believed her mother had drifted so far from where they had both started that she could no longer see value in anything that could not be measured in quarterly earnings. The final conversation between them happened 4 years before Elena died, standing in Catherine's glass corner office on the top floor of the Ashworth building. The whole of Elliott Bay spread out silver and cold behind them. It did not end with a simple complaint that her mother had never loved her enough. It went far deeper than that. Elena stood there, her voice shaking but steady underneath the shake, and said, "I am done spending my whole life trying to prove I deserve the thing you built. I want to build something of my own that is actually worth existing." Catherine did not answer right away. She simply stood there, one hand gripping the back of her leather chair so tightly her knuckles went pale, as though someone had reached into the foundation of a building she had spent 30 years constructing and pulled a single load-bearing brick straight out of the wall. Elena left the company the following week. She moved into a small converted storefront in the Rainier Valley and opened something she called Skyline Flight Lab, a nonprofit that partnered with a nearby regional airport to give local teenagers hands-on lessons in aviation mechanics and eventually, for the ones who stayed long enough, actual flight instruction in small donated aircraft. But she never once cut the thread connecting her back to her mother. She still called every few weeks. She still texted to check in when there was bad weather near Seattle. She still showed up for Thanksgiving, sitting a little stiffly at the long table, but showing up all the same. It was precisely because of that persistence, that refusal to fully walk away, that Elena's death would end up hurting more than anything else Catherine had ever endured. Mother and daughter had never actually stopped loving each other. They had simply run out of time to find their way back to comfortable ground. The night Elena died was a night thick with an early spring storm rolling in off the Sound, low clouds and unpredictable crosswinds that most experienced pilots would have grounded a flight for without a second thought. Elena had spent months building, alongside a group of her students, a small experimental glider designed specifically to be light, cheap, and safe enough that any of the program's teenagers could eventually learn to fly it themselves. She insisted on personally flight testing the final prototype before letting any of her students near the controls, refusing every offer from her own instructors to do it in her place. The wind shifted without warning during her final approach. Witnesses on the ground said the aircraft dropped hard, clipped the tree line at the edge of the airfield, and came apart before it ever reached the runway. Catherine received the phone call at 11 o'clock at night, standing barefoot in her kitchen with a glass of water she never got to drink, and from that exact moment, some part of her simply stopped functioning alongside her daughter. After the funeral, Catherine folded inward, and her grief slowly reshaped itself into a different kind of control. She poured tens of millions of dollars into something called the Elena Ashworth Aviation Foundation, launching memorial scholarships and new facilities at a pace that alarmed even her own board of directors. And while she was busy trying to hold on to whatever pieces of her daughter she could still grip, she unintentionally drove her only remaining child, her son Julian, further away than he had ever been. She inserted herself into every decision of his life, pressing him to step into leadership roles at the company, to help fill the space Elena had left behind, until Julian finally told her, in a voice flat with exhaustion, that he did not want to spend the rest of his life being a patch for a wound that was never his to begin with. He moved to Denver 2 years later. Since then, the only contact between mother and son had shrunk down to short, dutiful messages on birthdays. The morning of the 14th of March this year, exactly 11 full years since the day Elena died, Catherine was delayed by an emergency at one of the company's regional hangars, a fuel line issue that pulled her into a call she could not step away from, and it kept her from reaching the cemetery until nearly an hour past her usual time. She had no way of knowing that on the other side of the city, that same morning, a man named Marcus Bellamy and a boy named Wren had also arrived earlier than they normally would, because the boy had a school assembly to attend at noon. Two schedules that had never once crossed paths in 11 years finally intersected, without either side expecting it, on this one particular morning, when Catherine's car turned slowly onto the gravel path leading up toward the grave section. She saw two figures standing near her daughter's headstone from a distance, and something in her chest slowed down in a way she did not recognize. This was the most private place she had left in the world, hers and Elena's alone. And yet there was a man she had never met standing there, and a boy kneeling in the damp grass, carefully folding something small and pale gray, catching the weak morning light. She turned off the engine, sat still for a long moment, then stepped out, her shoes moving carefully across the cold gravel, her heart climbing with a question she had not had to ask herself in 11 years. Who were they? Why were they standing in the one place that had only ever belonged to her and her daughter? Catherine did not walk forward right away. She stopped roughly 10 steps back, behind a bare maple tree, and simply watched. The man had stepped back a little, letting the boy finish whatever he was doing on his own. The boy knelt on a folded jacket spread over the wet grass, his small hands holding a sheet of gray paper that was almost finished being shaped into something with wings, the careful angled folds of a paper airplane. The kind engineers sometimes sketch in the margins of blueprints when they are thinking. Before setting it down, the boy did something that made Catherine's entire body go rigid, as though she had just touched a live current. He pressed his thumb down on the center fold line 3 separate times, each press deliberate and even, and only then did he lift his hand away. That was Elena's habit. Not a loose, general resemblance of the kind people imagine when they miss someone deeply. That was a specific, private motion that only Catherine could possibly recognize, because she was the only person alive who had spent countless nights sitting beside her daughter's drafting table as a teenager, watching her fold and refold test sketches before ever showing them to anyone. Elena had always pressed the center crease of any folded paper exactly 3 times before opening it back up, an unconscious ritual, something no one could have learned simply by observing her from a distance. It had to have come from somewhere closer than that, somewhere passed down. Catherine stepped out from beneath the tree, her legs unsteady beneath her. As she got closer, she saw, written along one wing of the paper airplane, in careful, slightly uneven pencil handwriting, a short line of words, "To Mom, from Ren." She stopped completely still, her hand tightening around the stem of the white orchid until the petals began to crush inside her palm. The man turned and caught her eye. He froze for a second, and something shifted across his face, caution mixed with a flicker of recognition, as though he had seen this exact face somewhere before, in an old photograph on a phone screen, or in a business magazine he had scrolled past years earlier without paying much attention. But standing here in person, everything about it felt entirely different. "I am sorry," Catherine said, working hard to keep her voice level, even though her throat had gone tight. "This is my daughter's grave." The man nodded slowly. "I know," he said. "My name is Marcus Bellamy." The name meant nothing to Catherine. Elena had never once mentioned it, not in all the calls and texts and Thanksgiving dinners across the years they had still managed to keep. She looked over at the boy, who had stood up by then, still holding the paper airplane, his curious eyes moving up to study the strange woman now standing in front of his father. Those eyes made Catherine grip the edge of the headstone just to stay upright. A warm hazel brown, the outer corners tilting slightly upward exactly the way Elena's had, the exact eyes Catherine used to look into every single night while rocking her daughter to sleep more than 30 years earlier. "Is he?" Catherine could not finish the question. Her voice broke somewhere in the middle of it. Marcus looked at her for a long moment, as though deciding whether to finally say the thing he had carried quietly for 11 years. Then he took a slow breath, straightened his shoulders, and spoke without flinching. "This is Ren," he said. "My son and Elena's son." The ground beneath Catherine seemed to tilt in a single instant. She heard the wind moving through the bare branches overhead, heard traffic somewhere far beyond the cemetery gate, but all of it felt distant, muffled beneath a ringing in her own ears. She stepped back, one hand braced against the cold stone slab carved with her daughter's name, feeling as though the world had shifted several degrees beneath her feet. The white orchid slipped from her fingers and landed in the wet grass, its petals scattering among the dead leaves. "That is not possible," she whispered, more to herself than to him. Elena never mentioned any of this, not once. "He is 10 years old," Marcus said, his tone carrying no accusation at all, only the quiet weight of a truth finally being spoken after years of waiting for the right moment. Elena was 8 months pregnant the night the glider went down. Ren was born 4 days later, by emergency delivery, in a hospital about a mile from the airfield where she crashed. Ren, not fully understanding the conversation happening above his head, simply looked up at Catherine with an open, childlike curiosity, then knelt back down, and gently set the paper airplane on the stone slab beneath the carved letters of his mother's name. He did it with the quiet familiarity of someone who had performed this small ritual many times before, not for the first time at all. Catherine stared at the little gray airplane resting there against the gray stone and the dead winter grass, and she understood, all at once, that whatever she was about to hear in the next several minutes would not be a small story. It would be an entire chapter of her daughter's life she had never known existed, one that had been unfolding quietly, painfully, alongside her own grief for 11 straight years without her ever once suspecting it. "I need to hear everything," she said, her voice shaking but resolute. "All of it, if you will let me." Marcus looked over at his son for a moment, then back at Catherine, his eyes carrying the weariness of a man who had spent a decade guarding this exact secret. He did not answer right away. Instead, he crouched down and gently rested a hand on Wren's shoulder. "Can you go wait for me on that bench over there for a little while, buddy?" he said, his voice gentle but firm. "I need to talk with this lady for a bit." Wren nodded, glanced once more at Catherine, with a look of curiosity rather than fear, then jogged off toward an old wooden bench near the cemetery entrance. Once the boy was far enough away, Marcus turned back to face Catherine directly, and in his eyes she recognized not just caution, but 11 years of carrying something entirely alone, the specific kind of weariness that only comes from standing unprotected inside a storm for a very long time. "All right," he said, "but I need you to hear the whole thing without interrupting, because this is not only my story, this is Elena's story too, the part of her life you were probably always meant to know about." They sat down together on a nearby stone bench, far enough from Wren that he would not overhear, and Marcus began to speak slowly, unfolding a story he had clearly kept sealed for 11 long years. He had met Elena at the regional airfield where Skyline Flight Lab rented hangar space, back when he was working there as a licensed aircraft mechanic, keeping the program's small donated fleet actually airworthy. He was 26 years old at the time, the son of a long-haul trucker and a hospital cafeteria worker, someone who had learned engines the same hard, hands-on way Catherine's own father once had, though Marcus had no idea about that particular symmetry when he met her. He and Elena did not fall for each other in the way stories often tell it, the wealthy heiress rescuing the working-class mechanic. They found something rarer than that, a shared belief that real value only comes from work done with your own hands, and neither one of them cared much for the version of success measured only in dollar signs. Marcus described the evenings Elena used to stay behind after her students had gone home, sitting on an overturned toolbox in the hangar, watching him rebuild a carburetor while she sketched new wing designs in a battered spiral notebook. He talked about the way she always forgot to eat lunch when she was deep in a design problem, the way she hummed off-key without realizing it whenever she was concentrating, the fact that despite being one of the most gifted engineers he had ever met, she could never successfully parallel park a car to save her life. He did not describe some flawless, idealized version of her. He described a real, specific, occasionally clumsy person, someone he clearly still loved with his whole chest even after 11 years. That, he explained, was exactly how he had later chosen to describe her to Wren, not as a myth, but as a real person their son could actually feel close to. Then Marcus reached the part of the story that made Catherine bow her head, her two hands gripping each other tightly in her lap. Elena had not hidden their relationship out of shame, and not because she feared her mother would reject a mechanic with no college degree. What she wanted, more than anything, was to repair the relationship with her mother on her own terms first, as a grown woman standing on her own accomplishments, without bringing anyone else into the picture as leverage or as a shield. She used to tell Marcus that if she showed up while pregnant, right in the middle of the tension that still existed between her and her mother, Catherine might see it as an attempt to force her hand, to use a grandchild as a bargaining chip in an argument that had nothing to do with him. She wanted to go to her mother alone first, tell her plainly that she still loved her, that she was never coming back to run the company, but that she was also not turning her back on the family either. Only after that conversation did she plan to bring Marcus and the baby forward, introduced as a family she had chosen for herself, not a weapon in an ongoing war between mother and daughter. She never got the chance. The night of the crash was supposed to be the final test flight before she flew home to Seattle the following weekend specifically to have that conversation with her mother, face to face, for the first time in years. At that point in the story, Marcus paused and pressed the heel of his hand briefly against his eyes before continuing. "Elena was 8 months pregnant," he said. I remember the exact moment I got the call. The entire room seemed to tilt sideways around me. And for weeks afterward, I genuinely could not process the idea that the woman who fell asleep next to me every night could disappear on a single stormy evening. After the funeral, Marcus said he had tried more than once to reach out to Catherine directly. He had driven to the Ashworth building downtown, standing across the street with Elena's ultrasound photo folded in his jacket pocket, watching the glass doors open and close under a stream of reporters and lawyers who were already circling the sudden, public tragedy involving the company's heir apparent. He stood there for nearly half an hour before finally turning around and walking away. No one inside that building ever knew that the man carrying, quite literally, the only living piece of Elena Ashworth left in the world had stood right outside their front door. After Ren was born, Marcus said he wrote Catherine several letters over the years, explaining everything, but he never once mailed a single one of them. It was not pride that stopped him. He was afraid of stepping into the middle of a grieving, high-profile family, already fracturing under public scrutiny. He was afraid of a custody or inheritance dispute turning his newborn son into a headline. And more than anything, he did not know whether Catherine would ever come to see Ren as a child worth loving for his own sake, or simply as the last surviving piece of company property connected to a lost heir. Faced with that fear, he chose the one path he could actually control, raising his son entirely on his own. 1 year passed into 2, 2 into 5, 5 into 10. Marcus worked long shifts at a private aviation maintenance company by day and picked up small side repair jobs most evenings, teaching his son to be grateful without ever having to bow his head to anyone, to be careful with money without ever feeling ashamed of not having much of it. While Marcus was finishing this part of the story, another figure approached from the cemetery gate. An older man, silver threading through dark hair, carrying a worn leather satchel under one arm. That was Desmond Cole, Elena's longtime graduate school mentor, and in her final years, one of her closest friends and advisors at Skyline Flight Lab. Desmond was the only person who had known everything, that Elena and Marcus were together, that she was pregnant, and that she had been actively preparing to fly home and finally speak with her mother that exact week. He never raised Ren, never tried to replace Marcus in any way, but for 11 years he had quietly kept watch over the small family from a respectful distance, the one remaining witness to the entire piece of Elena's life that Catherine had never known about. "I kept this for 11 years, Desmond said, pulling a small worn notebook and an old digital voice recorder from his satchel. Elena asked me to hold onto it in case it was ever needed. Catherine took the recorder in both trembling hands. Desmond pressed play, and Elena's voice, warm, familiar, painfully alive, filled the quiet space around the headstones. She did not spend a single second blaming her mother. Instead, she recalled the times Catherine had taught her to change a bicycle tire in the rain, the evenings spent in cold bleachers cheering at swim meets, even the time Catherine had marched her back across 2 neighborhoods to apologize to a younger girl she had once excluded from a birthday party. Then her voice softened, and she said the words that finally brought Catherine down onto the stone bench completely, both hands pressed over her face. "I understand why you want me sitting in that boardroom someday," Elena's recorded voice said. "But I need you to understand something too. A daughter can walk away from the path her mother built for her and still never once walk away from her mother. I am coming home this weekend, Mom. There is something important I need to tell you in person." The recording ended there, cutting off mid-breath, the way unfinished things often do. Catherine sat in silence for a very long time, absorbing the fact that the reconciliation she had assumed would never come had actually been only days away when her daughter died. In the days that followed, Catherine did not call a lawyer. She did not hire a private investigator, the old reflex she still carried from decades of needing every fact verified before trusting it. Instead, she asked Marcus directly whether he would be willing to allow a paternity test, not because she doubted anything he had told her, but because she wanted every step forward with Ren, with Marcus, to rest on ground that could never later be questioned or challenged by anyone. Marcus agreed immediately, without hesitation. The results came back 1 week later, confirming what both adults had already understood the moment Catherine first looked into Ren's eyes beside her daughter's headstone. The first official meeting was arranged at a small waterfront park in West Seattle, where Marcus said Ren felt most comfortable, since he had spent countless afternoons there, flying kites with classmates. Catherine arrived alone, no driver, no assistant, wearing a plain wool coat instead of anything from her usual wardrobe. She waited near the swing set, her heart beating faster than it had in any multi-million-dollar negotiation she had ever walked into. When Marcus brought Ren over, the boy studied her with a careful, evaluating gaze. Not fear exactly, more the natural caution of a child who had learned early to watch adults closely before deciding whether to trust them. He did not call her grandmother right away. He simply offered a short, polite greeting, then stood pressed slightly against his father's side, one hand gripping the hem of his jacket. "Hello, Miss Ashworth," Ren said. Catherine knelt down to his eye level, something she rarely remembered doing even with her own children, back when they were young, and she still ran every meeting standing up. "Hello to you too," she said, keeping her voice as gentle as she could manage. "I am really glad to finally meet you." Ren did not ask who she was in any direct way. With the particular sensitivity of a child raised almost entirely by one steady, attentive parent, he seemed to sense that something significant was happening, even without fully understanding what. He only asked whether she knew how to fly a kite. When Catherine admitted she had never actually tried, despite owning an aerospace company, he laughed, a real, unguarded laugh, and pulled her by the hand out toward the open grass. That afternoon stretched on slowly, filled with the sound of a child's laughter and the clumsy, tangled attempts of a 62-year-old woman who had never imagined she would ever get to do something this simple again. Marcus stood back, watching from a distance, and in his eyes Catherine recognized a weariness that had not fully disappeared, though it had visibly softened. A few days later, Catherine visited Marcus in Ren's apartment for the first time, a modest 2-bedroom unit above a hardware store in the Rainier Valley. No elevator, the wooden stairs creaking under every step. Inside, everything was clean and carefully arranged. Hand-sewn curtains, a small desk in the corner covered in schoolbooks and homemade paper airplane models in every stage of completion. But Catherine also noticed the water stain spreading across one corner of the ceiling, the radiator that rattled loudly whenever it kicked on, the tight, careful budgeting a single father raising a child alone for a full decade had to live inside every single day. Her first instinct, the one carved deep into her after decades of solving every problem with resources and money, rose up almost immediately. She began talking about a larger apartment downtown, a better private school for Ren, an account set up in Marcus's name so he would never have to worry about a bill again. Marcus listened to all of it, without interrupting, exactly the way he had asked of her from their very first conversation. But once she finished, he set his coffee mug down carefully, and said, gently but firmly, that he appreciated the offer more than she probably realized, but that he had raised his son alone for 10 years without anyone's money, and he needed her to understand that Ren having a wealthy grandmother now did not mean his father suddenly needed rescuing. What he actually wanted from her, he said, was not a check. It was simply her showing up, consistently, the same way any grandparent should. Catherine sat with that for a long moment, then nodded and said she understood. It would take her many more months to actually prove that she meant it. Over the following weeks, she began showing up in smaller, steadier ways. She learned Ren's school pickup schedule, and occasionally sat quietly at the back of the auditorium during his science presentations. She learned that Ren, like his mother before him, loved taking machines apart just to understand how they went back together, and she brought over an old disassembled model airplane engine one Saturday so the two of them could rebuild it piece by piece on Marcus's kitchen table, laying every bolt out in careful order along a clean towel, the exact ritual her own father had once taught her decades earlier in a cold garage outside Tacoma. She did not tell Ren the story behind that habit that day. She simply let him learn it the same quiet way she had. One evening, after a dinner that had grown noticeably less stiff and formal than their earlier visits, Ren pulled a small paper box out of his backpack while Marcus was clearing the table. Inside was something he had spent several evenings building on his own, using the same sturdy paper he always folded his airplanes from. It was a tiny model of a dinner table, with 4 small paper figures seated around it, carefully colored, representing himself, his father, Catherine, and a 4th figure wearing a blue-collared shirt, which he explained was his mother, drawn from the handful of photographs he had grown up studying. "I made this for you," Ren said, handing the box over with both hands. "This is our family's dinner table." Catherine took the little model, her throat tightening as she looked closely at it. 4 paper figures sat around the tiny table. But when she counted the chairs again, she realized there were 5. The 5th one, positioned slightly off to the side, was still completely empty. "Why 5 chairs?" she asked softly. Wren looked at her, then glanced briefly at his father, as though weighing how to answer. "Dad told me you have another kid too," he said. "My other aunt or uncle, I guess. I figured that chair should stay open for them, in case they ever want to come sit down with us." The simple sentence of a 10-year-old struck Catherine harder than any accusation ever could have. For months she had learned how to show up for Wren, learned how to listen to Marcus, but she had not once picked up the phone to call Julian, her only remaining child, the son who had left Denver behind years earlier because he had grown tired of being treated like a placeholder for the daughter she had lost. She had poured every ounce of her atonement into Wren and Marcus, while continuing to avoid the closest wound, the one she herself had caused and never properly addressed. She placed the paper model carefully on Marcus's bookshelf, right beside a small wooden model plane Elena had built as a teenager, and she sat looking at that empty fifth chair for a long time after Marcus and Wren had gone to bed. Alone that night in her apartment, overlooking the Sound, city lights scattered across the dark water below her window, she finally allowed herself to think honestly about Julian, not as a gap that needed filling in the company org chart, but as a person, a son she had loved deeply but had never learned to love in a way that let him simply be himself. That night she picked up her phone and scrolled to Julian's number, the same number she had kept saved for years despite rarely using it. Her thumb hovered over the call button, hesitating. She set the phone back down without dialing, knowing a rushed midnight call would never carry enough weight to repair a wound that had taken years to form. But she also knew, looking at that empty chair and Wren's small paper model, that she could not put this off any longer. There was one more door that needed opening, and this time she was determined not to let it close again through her own silence, the way she had let it close with both Elena and Julian for far too long already. Julian Ashworth had been living in Denver for 6 years, working as a structural engineer specializing in earthquake-resistant public buildings, schools, libraries, community centers, places he believed mattered precisely because they were built to protect ordinary people during their worst moments. He had not left Seattle out of hatred for his mother. He left because every time he sat across from her at a company dinner, every time she called, he felt he was being looked at not as Julian, but as an empty space that needed to be filled, a substitute for the child she had lost. Catherine called him on a quiet weekend evening, her voice shaking more than it had during any earnings call in her entire career. She did not open with business, did not ask about his current projects the way she usually did. She simply said she needed to see him, that there was something important she had to explain in person, and that this time she wanted to be the one who traveled, rather than asking him to come home. 3 weeks later, Catherine flew to Denver and sat across from Julian in a small coffee shop near his office. She told him everything, about Elena, about Marcus, about Wren, about the paper table and the empty fifth chair her grandson had built for a family member he had never even met. "I have a nephew," Julian said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper, as if he could hardly believe he was the one saying it. You do," Catherine answered, "and I think it is time you two met each other. But before we get to that, there is something else I need to say. I need to apologize to you properly for what I did after your sister died." Julian went silent, waiting. He had been waiting for this particular sentence far longer than he wanted to admit out loud. "I used to believe your deepest pain came from all the years I was not fully present when you were small," Catherine continued, her voice unsteady, but not backing away from it. "I was wrong about that. The real problem started after Elena died, when I refused to let you grieve in your own way. I pushed you into meetings and leadership roles, trying to turn you into someone who could fill the space she left behind, instead of letting you simply be yourself, carrying your own version of that loss." Julian lowered his head, a single tear escaping before he could stop it. "You have no idea how much that hurt," he said. "I lost my sister, but I also lost myself, because you stopped seeing me as Julian. You only saw what was left over." "I know," Catherine said, offering no excuses, no attempt to soften what she had done, the way she had spent an entire career doing in negotiations. "And I am sorry. You never owed me proof that you deserved to exist in this family. You only ever needed to be you." They sat quietly for a long while after that, the ordinary sounds of the coffee shop drifting around them. Eventually Julian asked whether he could meet Wren, and his voice, though still guarded, carried a note of hope Catherine had not heard from him in years. The meeting happened 2 weeks later at Catherine's apartment, when Marcus brought Ren over on a Saturday afternoon. The moment Julian saw the boy, he froze in the middle of the living room, one hand rising to cover his mouth. The eyes, the way Ren slightly tilted his head when studying something new, even the exact way he pursed his lips while concentrating. All of it was unmistakably Elena, traits Julian, who had grown up alongside his sister, recognized instantly, and more clearly than anyone else in the room could have. "Hi, Uncle Julian," Ren said, a little shyly. Julian knelt down exactly the way Catherine had once done at the waterfront park months earlier. "Hey there," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "I am your Uncle Julian." That afternoon, uncle and nephew found common ground quickly. Ren pulled out his notebook full of paper airplane blueprints, while Julian, drawing on his structural engineering background, showed him how wing shape actually affected lift and drag, sketching diagrams together at the kitchen table. They talked about small spaces, about how a single well-designed room could change the way an entire family gathered, about how a bridge, or even a simple paper airplane, could connect two places that once felt impossibly far apart. Marcus watched from across the room, and in his eyes Catherine saw a new kind of warmth settling in, another thread being quietly stitched back into a family that had spent a decade coming apart. Julian did not fully forgive his mother that day, and he told her so plainly before he left. His wound had taken far too many years to form to heal after a single conversation, however honest it had been. He needed time. He needed to see this change repeated, proven again and again, not simply promised once over coffee in Denver. But he did promise he would start coming back to Seattle more often, not out of obligation, but because he had genuinely found a new reason to. A nephew with his sister's exact eyes, waiting for him to teach him a few more things about how wings actually work. Before Catherine left Denver that trip, Julian walked her all the way to the door, and for the first time in years, he wrapped his arms around her in a brief but completely genuine hug. "I will call you," he said, "not about work, just to check in on Ren." Catherine nodded, unable to say anything more, understanding that a small promise like that one meant more to her than any contract she had ever signed across her entire career. In the early weeks of the following year, once the relationship between Catherine and Marcus's small family had grown steady and warm, a new complication surfaced. It did not come from emotion this time. It came from the very world Catherine had spent her entire life inside, the world of attorneys, contracts, and carefully worded clauses. Ashworth Aerospace's legal team, upon learning of Ren's existence, had prepared a detailed proposal establishing a trust fund worth tens of millions of dollars in the boy's name, accompanied by a long list of protective conditions, rules governing how the money could be spent, who held final approval on major expenses, and an oversight committee made up entirely of company lawyers who would monitor his upbringing until he turned 18. The head of the legal department presented this proposal to Catherine in the same top-floor conference room, where Elena had once stood delivering her final heartbreaking words before leaving the company for good. On paper, the proposal was completely reasonable, designed to shield Ren's future assets from any legal or financial risk. But when Catherine reached the clause requiring every expense above a certain amount to be approved by the oversight committee, even though Marcus was Ren's father and sole legal guardian, something inside her recoiled. The old version of herself, the one who had spent decades believing she always knew what was best for the people around her, was ready to sign it without a second thought. That was the exact instinct that had once pushed Julian out of her life for 6 years. That was the exact instinct that could easily do the same thing all over again. Instead, she set the pen down, closed the folder, and told her legal team she needed more time, that she wanted to hear from the people this decision would actually affect before finalizing anything. She called Marcus first, inviting him to the office, a building he had never once set foot inside. When Marcus read through the proposal, his expression tightened, his hands gripping the papers harder with every page. He read the oversight clause twice, and when he finally looked up at Catherine, his eyes carried the same old fear he had once felt standing outside the Ashworth building all those years earlier, worried that his son's life was once again about to be decided for him by people who had never asked what he actually wanted. "This is not what I want for him," Marcus said, his voice trembling but firm. "I understand you want to protect Ren, but if I have to get permission from a room full of lawyers every time I want to spend money on my own child, that is not protection anymore. That is control wearing a different jacket." Catherine listened without interrupting, exactly as she had spent the past year training herself to do. Afterward, she called Julian, explained the entire situation, and asked for his perspective as someone who understood exactly what it felt like to have his life decided for him, under the label of love. "You are walking straight back down the old road," Julian told her over the phone, not softening it at all. "You think you are protecting Ren, but really you are doing the same thing you did to me, deciding what is best for someone else because you assume you already know." His words left Catherine sitting in silence for a long time. She also sat down with Ren directly, in language a 10-year-old could understand, explaining simply that there was a sum of money being set aside for his future, and she asked what he thought about who should be trusted to decide how it was used while he was still young. Ren answered instantly, without a trace of hesitation, the way children often do. "My dad," he said. "He always knows what is best for me, even on the months when we do not have very much money at all." After hearing all three of those answers, Catherine returned to her legal team with a completely different request than the original draft. She asked them to still establish the trust, securing Ren's long-term future, education, healthcare, future investments, but to remove the outside oversight committee entirely. Day-to-day decisions, Ren's immediate needs, would remain solely with Marcus, the father who had raised him alone for 10 years before a single dollar of Ashworth money had ever entered his life. When the final agreement was signed, there was no clause left inside it that could turn money into a tool for controlling either Marcus's or Ren's life. It was the clearest possible proof that Catherine had not simply softened with age or loneliness. She had genuinely learned something. Real love does not live in controlling people out of fear. It lives in trusting them enough to let them stand on their own 2 feet. When Julian heard the news through a call from Marcus, he was quiet for a moment, before laughing. A relieved, surprised, unmistakably proud sound Catherine had not heard from her son in years. The following week, without needing to be asked, he booked a flight back to Seattle on his own, saying he wanted to stay a little longer this time, long enough to help Ren design a few more paper airplane blueprints for a small backyard project the boy had been dreaming about. 1 year later, when the 14th of March came around again, Catherine once more drove out to Evergreen Rest Cemetery, just as she had done for 12 consecutive years now. But this time she did not arrive alone, and she was not the first one there either. Walking up the familiar gravel path, she saw an entire small circle of people already gathered around Elena's headstone. Marcus stood beside Ren, who had grown noticeably taller over the past year. Julian stood on the other side, a paper tube of blueprints tucked under one arm, his gaze warm as he watched his nephew. Desmond Cole stood quietly off to one side, exactly as he had every year before, the one person who had silently witnessed this entire journey from its most painful beginning all the way to this moment. Ren knelt down in front of the headstone and pulled a new paper airplane from his jacket pocket, this one folded from deep blue paper, noticeably more precise than the gray one from the year before. But the motion of pressing the crease 3 times before setting it down remained exactly the same, an invisible thread still connecting him to the mother he had never gotten the chance to meet. "I made this one bigger than last year's," Ren said, placing it carefully at the base of the headstone. "Because there are more of us now. We need something a little sturdier to hold everyone together." No one said anything for a moment. A light wind moved off the sound, threading through branches just beginning to bud with early spring growth, and Catherine stood in the middle of that small circle, feeling a kind of peace she had not known in 12 years of grief. She was no longer the lonely woman carrying a single white orchid to a grave and back again in silence. She had become part of a circle now, held together not by money, but by time, by listening, by the slow repeated practice of failing and trying again. After the gathering at the cemetery, the whole group drove together to a newly completed building, not far from the airfield where Elena's flight lab had once operated. A small community aviation center, funded largely through the Elena Ashworth Aviation Foundation, where the ground floor had just welcomed its first small tenants. A corner shop displayed a hand-painted sign reading Bellamy Precision Repair, where Marcus had moved his aircraft maintenance business, closer now to the community he had stayed rooted in for over a decade. In a bright corner window upstairs sat a small work table, covered with a blue cloth, surrounded by sheets of paper, scissors, and a metal ruler. That was Ren's paper airplane corner, where he now spent afternoons after school, sometimes teaching other neighborhood kids how to press a crease exactly 3 times before letting a plane fly, a habit that no longer belonged only to the mother he never met, but had quietly passed on to an entirely new generation. When the Foundation's board first proposed naming the building the Catherine Ashworth Center, she refused immediately. "Name it after Elena," she said, "or do not name it after any single person at all. Just call it something that belongs to this neighborhood." In the end, the building carried a simple name, chosen by Wren himself, drawing inspiration from the paper airplanes he still folded every single year. They called it the Paper Wing Center. That evening, instead of retreating back to her downtown apartment overlooking the Sound, the whole family cooked dinner together in the community kitchen on the ground floor of the center, a space open to anyone in the neighborhood who wanted to come cook and share a meal. Catherine took charge of roasting a chicken, a recipe Marcus had taught her more than a year earlier. This time, she left it in the oven a little too long, scorching one corner of the tray black. "Grandma burned it again," Wren announced, laughing loudly. "You still have not figured out timing, huh?" "You are still not there yet," Julian teased, standing beside Marcus, both of them chopping vegetables at the counter. Marcus burst out laughing, a relieved, easy sound filling the whole kitchen. "Better than last year at least," he said. "Most of it is still edible this time." Catherine stood there, tongs still in hand, looking around a kitchen full of laughter, feeling warmer inside than she had ever felt standing inside any luxury boardroom across 63 years of living. Wren ran over, took her hand, and pulled her toward the long table where everyone was already sitting down. "Grandma, come sit with us," he said. That dinner was far from perfect. The chicken was burned in one corner. The salad was slightly oversalted because Julian had not yet mastered seasoning by feel. The dessert Wren had attempted to bake on his own leaned heavily to one side. But when Catherine looked around that long, imperfect table, she no longer saw a single chair sitting empty out of anger or distance. Every person present had a seat, and every seat belonged there. She thought back to the final words in Elena's old recording, that a daughter could walk away from the path her mother built, and still never truly walk away from her mother. Sitting among the people she loved, inside a community kitchen that carried her daughter's spirit in every corner, Catherine finally understood, completely, what Elena had always been trying to tell her. The thing Elena had actually wanted to build, beyond every future aircraft contract, beyond any executive title, had never been anything bearing the Ashworth name. It had always simply been a place people could return to. No matter how far they had traveled, no matter how deeply they had hurt one another, there would always be a seat waiting, warm, and never ever locked. Catherine sat in that kitchen for a long time after everyone else had gone home for the night. The lights dimmed one by one until only she remained, sitting at the long table, Wren's laughter still echoing somewhere in the back of her mind, like a promise she already knew she intended to keep. The story of the Ashworth family closed there, at a table where no chair was ever left empty again. Thank you for staying with me all the way to the end of this journey, through Catherine, through Marcus, through Wren. If you made it this far, something in this story clearly reached you, and I am genuinely grateful for that. Catherine Ashworth, Marcus Bellamy, and Wren are names I created for this story. Ashworth Aerospace and Flight Systems has never existed outside these words. But the pain of a mother running out of time to make peace with her child before losing them, the quiet exhaustion of a father raising a son entirely alone, the invisible distance that can grow between successful people and the very communities that raise them, those things are real, happening somewhere right now, possibly closer to you than you realize. If you are a parent who feels distant from your child right now because of work, because of pride, because of simply not knowing how to bridge the gap anymore, maybe the thing Wren said to Catherine is also the exact thing your own child is quietly wishing they could say to you. That what they actually need is not a bigger gift or a bigger gesture, but one evening where you truly sit down beside them, fold a paper airplane together, if that is what it takes, and simply listen without trying to fix anything. And if you know someone raising a child completely on their own, sometimes what they need most is not someone handing them money. Sometimes what they need is someone trusting them enough to hand them an open door and then stepping back, letting them walk through it on their own 2 feet. Honestly, when I reached the part where Wren offered that empty 5th chair to an aunt he had never even met, I had to stop writing for a moment. I found myself thinking about the empty chairs in my own life, the phone calls I keep quietly postponing for another day, the people I still assume, somewhere in the back of my mind, that I will always have plenty of time to return to. I hope you always find the courage to be the one who steps forward first, and I hope that somewhere, someday, you become the bridge for someone standing alone, waiting for exactly that. If this story moved something in you, please follow this channel and send it to the first person who came to your mind while listening. See you again in the next one.
The moral of this story, love without room to breathe slowly turns into control. And control, even when it comes from a good heart, can push away the very people we are trying hardest to hold on to. Catherine did not lose her daughter, and nearly lost her son and grandson, because she loved too little. She lost them because she kept trying to decide their lives for them, instead of trusting them to walk their own paths, and simply being present while they did. Real love does not measure someone by how closely they follow the plan we built for them. It shows up quietly, again and again without conditions attached, and it lets go of the need to be right in exchange for the chance to actually be there. The families we keep are not the ones we control. They are the ones we choose to show up for, patiently, honestly, one imperfect dinner at a time, until every chair at the table finally has someone sitting in it.